Hello everyone, it's Lindsay, and for today's Tip Tuesday, we're going to talk all about using fabric in your paper crafting projects. I predominantly use fabric in my Bible journaling entries when I do use it, but you can also use this for scrapbooking and, mini albums and things like that too. So don't feel like you can't use these if you're not a Bible journaler. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about die cutting fabric, making bow clippies, different ways to add fabric embellishments to your pages, whether you have a sewing machine or not, and just some of the different ways to get fabrics and do ruffling and pleating and things like that. So let me kind of scoot this to the side and I'll show you some examples that I have in my Bible and another project that I did, just so that you kind of know where we're going with this. This page here, I added a little bit of fabric down at the bottom. I do have a process for this page, so I will link it down below. Here it looks like it is actually stitched onto the page, but it is not. So I will show you how to get that look without actually stitching onto the Bible page. I have sewn in my Bible before, but it's much easier to do it this way than just stitch directly into there. And also using fabric bow clips. I think that's the way that most of us are familiar with using fabric. But I know a lot of people went out and bought a bunch of fabric to do bow clips, and now you're stuck with a bunch of fabric and don't know what to do with it. So I'm hoping this will give you some inspiration for different ways to incorporate it into other areas of your journaling. This one here was just using a teeny tiny piece of fabric that I had laying on my desk at the time to tie a little bow through a charm. If you didn't have a charm, you could also just tie a little bow and add it as an embellishment. And so while it does add some bulk where the knot is, it's not super chunky. So for most people, I don't think that it would be an issue adding it into a journaling Bible or something like that. So here I want to show you can use bow clips not just at the top of the page, but on tags and things like that as well. Again, using just one piece of fabric or a thinner fabric to make sure that I'm not adding too much bulk, but just bringing that fabric into other areas other than just, the mop that happens at the top of my Bible. This one here is just another style of ruffle, again showing how to add it without actually stitching it to the page or to the card, adding a little fabric there, and then another big fluffy bow. And this one here, just adding a scrap of fabric behind a die cut piece. So many of the devotional kits from Illustrated Faith last year had fabric scraps tying the kit together. So I know some of you have the fabric laying around, not quite sure what to do with it. And so this is a way just to incorporate some little pieces and scraps into your pages. Now for Gratitude Documented last year, I kind of really started to play with fabric in different ways. So I did some die cutting with fabric, so I have some tips for that for you guys today. Die cutting just some leaves and flowers out of fabric. Again, you can just use pattern paper, but I like the texture that it does, and sometimes the patterns, I'm drawn to a certain pattern, or I have a bunch of it laying around and want to put it to use, so that's a way to use it. Here I used, again, some leaves die cut from fabric, but I'm going to also show you how to do a fabric tag. So this is a tag that's got cardstock on the back, so if I wanted to type on it or write on it, I can, but then I have the fun texture and pattern of fabric on the front, and then just stitch some cardstock. So I like to mix paper and fabric in my projects. And then here, one last one, just a fun little ruffle piece behind my photo. This one didn't involve a sewing machine. I find it very helpful to have a sewing machine. I think that things hold up a little bit better, and the results are a little bit better if I sew onto it. But if you don't have one, I will show you how to do this as well. So let me scoot this aside for just a second while we talk about different ways to purchase fabric, because I know not everybody is familiar with that system, especially if you've never grown up with that, you don't sew yourself. I grew up with a grandma who sewed like crazy. A lot of my dresses as a child were sewn by my grandma, so I was been around it for a long time, but I know next to nothing about it. So I will just share with you the basic things you need to know if you're going to be using it in this way. So the easiest and probably the most cost-efficient way to get fabric for something like this, if you're using it in small amounts, are these here. So they sell these in little quarters like this, or they have a slightly bigger one pattern folded up that you can get it like at Walmart. They do have it at other craft stores that sell fabric, but Walmart is one of the cheaper places to get these from. This package here was from Walmart. It came with several different patterns. You can see the edges are already finished and cut down for you. And so this is a great way to get, multiple patterns all at once. I do want to say that this was maybe close to $10 for the package for this, which can be a little bit pricey. But the single patterns are like $1, $2, and I think it's 1/4 of a yard square. So you do get quite a bit of fabric. I typically buy my fabric off the bolts. So you might remember, be familiar with seeing them on those big bolts with the fabric all folded up on there. And maybe it's a little bit intimidating to go and get fabric that way if you've never done it that way before. So you order by yardage, and really you can get whatever measurement cut that you want. So you don't have to order, or you don't have to purchase a full yard of a fabric. You may not realize that you can get smaller amounts. So I'll typically ask for 1/8 of a yard or 1/4 of a yard if it's something that I know I'm going to want to make bigger items with, or a fabric like this one here that I really love the pattern and I'm going to want to use again and again and again. But typically 1/8 of a yard is plenty. And when you're only getting 1/8 of a yard of a fabric, even if it's a $10 fabric, that's going to be less than $1 for that piece of, or right around $1 for that piece of fabric. So, hopefully that kind of helps you. You don't need to buy a whole yard of whatever pattern and be stuck with a whole bunch of leftover. But don't be afraid to pick some up, grab some for you, and then share with a friend, or make some of these embellishments to pass along to a friend as well. Or just use fabric. I've used old shirts before. I've used sheets, curtains, things like that maybe you have laying around that you're going to throw away. Don't be afraid to cut those up and use those as well. So one thing that I found helpful when working with fabric, if I want it to maintain some stiffness to it, is to add a interfacing to it. So when you're doing bow clips and things like that, you don't need to do this step. But if you're going to be die cutting, I found it helpful to do this or to add cardstock to it. So for this one here, I'm just using some fusible midweight interfacing. Now they do have a variety of different kinds, different weights, different types. So you just have to figure out what your preference is. This one's probably a more medium. It's just enough to add some structure to it so that it's easier to die cut, but still has the softness of fabric. So you still get that floppy fabric look to it. Another thing that I like that this does is it helps when you're die cutting so that the edges don't fray as much. So you'll notice on this piece of fabric, where I tore it, the edge is fraying, but anywhere where the interfacing is, it's going to help prevent that fraying. So if you're die cutting a shape, you want it to maintain that shape, so you don't want it to fray away to nothing. And so this kind of helps with that. When die cutting fabric, I do find it helpful to run it through my die cutting machine twice if I'm going through a manual die cutting machine. You may also find it helpful to use a precision base plate. That's like a metal plate that you can put in your die cutting machine. I don't have one of those, but I think that that would really help give you a nice clean cut. Even when I add interfacing, run it through twice. Sometimes I'll even add a piece of cardstock underneath my fabric that I'm die cutting. So I'll have my die cut piece, or my piece of fabric. Trying to find all my stuff here. Add a piece, like a scrap piece of cardstock right here underneath, and then add my die to the top and run it through. So this piece is just acting as a shim to help increase the pressure when it goes through, and it gives you a cleaner cut. And so this isn't actually stuck to the fabric. You can just take that away, and then you'll have a cleaner cut. But I do still have to go in there with some scissors to just kind of clean up any edges as I'm pulling it away from the main piece of fabric. So just keep that in mind. It is, it's just more delicate than when you're working with paper. But if you don't want to fuss with interfacing, because you do need to read the directions, do this exactly how the directions say. You need to steam it onto here to get a good, get it adhered very, very well. If you don't want to mess with that, if you don't want to buy that, you can also just attach the fabric to some cardstock, and this is how I did the tag. So what I have here are some double-sided adhesive sheets. These come in a variety of shapes, sizes, and brands. I will link some options down below. This is just one from Sizzix that I found at Hobby Lobby that were 6x6 sheets, so it was a little bit more manageable for me. So I've cut down a piece. Basically, this is adhesive on both sides, but it also has a backing on both sides. So you can add this to cardstock, fabric, whatever medium that you're die cutting, and then that way you have adhesive to it, and it makes it like a sticker. So if I was to have a piece of cardstock, and then I'm going to go ahead and add this to my cardstock. So I'm just going to pull one of the backers off here. Okay, so this one goes away. This has stickiness now exposed. I'm going to stick that down onto my cardstock. And I found it works better in this order rather than trying to stick it to the fabric. So I'm going to stick it to my cardstock first. I'm going to pull this other backing sheet off. Now, this piece of cardstock is covered in that adhesive. This is sticky. And then I would stick this to the back of, I'm trying to use fabric that I don't mind if I mess up. Stick this to the back of my fabric, so sticky side to the back of the fabric. And then now I have a piece of fabric that is backed with cardstock. So it's made it so that the fabric is much stiffer. So if I'm wanting to do, you know, die cut pieces like those tags or something like that, now I can run this through my typewriter and type on this. I can run it through my die cutting machine, and that cardstock is going to stay on there. So it definitely adds, you know, some substance to the fabric and makes it a little bit easier to work with. And then you can stitch and embellish and do whatever you want on this. And then it's very easy just to add some adhesive. I like double-sided adhesive, tape runners, add that and then stick it to your page, and it's, you know, super simple that way. So that might benefit you if you're wanting to die cut, you know, alphas. How fun would it be to die cut some different alphas out of here? I had some floating around here. And do your title out of fabric alphas. So this one here is just backed with the interfacing, but again, you'd have, you know, much stiffer if you used cardstock, and that kind of thing. So that is some tips for die cutting with it and that kind of thing. Let's talk about cutting it. I know that seems like a very basic thing, but I like to have that rough edge to my fabric pieces. And so you can just take a piece of fabric, cut a little notch into the end here, and then just pull it away from itself, and that's going to give you that torn edge. You can clean up any extra strings if it's bothering you, but now you've got that raw edge. Now this is going to continue to fray and be raw, so just keep that in mind if you're wanting something that's going to hold up long time, and you don't want it to wither away to nothingness. This you may want to use like the pinking shears that give you the finished edge like you see on here if you don't want it to fray away. But I like the frayed look, I like the texture, and so I just tear it. So let's talk about ruffling. There's a lot of different ways to do ruffles. You can do it without a sewing machine or with a sewing machine. I prefer the sewing machine just because it adds some extra stability to it. I know it's going to hold up for the long haul. So I'm not going to show me actually stitching. There are plenty of tutorials online that show you all the fancy nitty-gritty that you need to know. But for just basic stitching, I just have a piece of fabric here. And to do a ruffle, you can do just one stitching line, but I find it a little bit better and easier to do if I do two. So what I've done is I've just done a straight stitch. I've run it up the length of the fabric, and then just before I get to the end, I'm going to do 1 or 2 stitches horizontal, I guess, perpendicular to the stitch line, and then I'm going to come back down and stitch this way. So it's one long continuous stitch going up the fabric and making like a big giant U. You want to make sure that you do not cross over your first stitch line. So when you're coming back down with the second stitch, do not cross over this first line, because then you won't be able to pull it and ruffle it like I'm going to show you here. When I did this, I used a different color thread for the bobbin thread just for the sake of the video and showing you guys, but you might find that helpful as well because you need to be able to identify which is your top thread that goes to the needle and which is the bobbin thread that comes from the bottom. So my bobbin thread is black, my top thread is white. So I went ahead and ran that straight stitch. I like to have my stitch length as long as possible. I have done it with just a regular stitch length as well. So if you don't want to mess with changing those things, you don't have to. Typically a stitch length is from 2 to 3. I bump mine up to 5, and it's just a little bit easier when doing this process. But what you're going to do is you're just going to grab a hold of your bobbin threads. Those are the threads that are on the bottom from the bobbin. Mine are black. I'm going to hold on to those, and then I'm just going to push the fabric along the threads. So I'm not even messing with that top white thread. I'm just pushing the fabric along the black, and you're just going to want to go nice and slow. If the thread breaks, you got to start all over. So you want to make sure that you go nice and slow, just giving gentle pulling and just working the fabric up until I get it as pleated and ruffly as I want. And you can see here how that's ruffled on itself. Super, super easy. And then you can just tie this off and then your ruffle is secure. So now you can add this with just some adhesive. If I'm gluing fabric to paper, I like to use liquid adhesive. I feel like that works a little bit better, except for one of the other ways I'm going to show you, but typically just use liquid adhesive. And now I've got this fun little ruffle piece that I can add to things. But if you don't have a sewing machine and can't do that, you can also do it just directly to cardstock. So what I have here is just a piece of cardstock. I've added a line of double-sided adhesive. Typically I work on a larger piece and then cut it down once I've attached it, but for the sake of this, we just have a small piece here. I have a small piece of fabric, and I'm going to stick down the end of the fabric, fold it back on itself, if you can see that, and then push it down into the adhesive, fold it back onto itself, push it down into the adhesive, fold it back down on itself, push it down in the adhesive, and just continue to do that till I get to the end. Now, if you don't have a sewing machine, this is what you're left with. So your ruffles are fluffy and can be, you know, manipulated. So I will typically add like a die cut piece over the top of this or some other embellishment or ephemera on the top to help secure it. But now I've got, this is basically its own embellishment. So I can add adhesive to the back side of here and attach it to whatever I want. And then I've got that fun ruffle. Because I have a sewing machine, I prefer to go over this with a stitch line just to secure it. And that helps the ruffles lay flat, but also helps it stick into the adhesive, because you can see I can very easily pull this off of the adhesive. I find that dry adhesive like this works better because I don't have to worry about waiting for the glue to dry. It can be very tricky with liquid glue when doing this technique. If you are okay with using hot glue, that might be a better way if you're wanting it to stay nice and secure on its own without anything over the top. Using hot glue will make sure that it stays, you know, nice and secure, but just keep in mind that glue is going to leak through your fabric, and so you might end up with, you know, stiff areas and things like that. So better to have a sewing machine and reinforce it, or leave it like this and then just add embellishments on the top. And so now I've got this piece that I can add to whatever I want. Same thing here, I can add, if I want, add cardstock to the back of it to give it some substance and make it a little bit easier to adhere as well. Okay, for just regular ruffles without the cardstock, you can also just take a piece of fabric and just fold it back on itself, create little pleats, and then just tuck this behind a die cut piece. You know, I'll usually just kind of hold it on like this, add a little blob of glue, stick it down, put my embellishment on top, and it all kind of just sandwiches together. And that's going to give you that fun texture like I had behind that bird die cut piece. Just gives you a fun ruffle. So there is that. I also like to add it just behind things, behind something like a die cut or a word fetty or alphabet stickers. This is just a simple piece of fabric. Again, I would use probably liquid adhesive to adhere this to the fabric, but me with a sewing machine, I would stitch right over the top of this. And then now I've just got a bumped up embellishment. So it's not as plain as just this, you know, word fetty that was on here. It's got that little bit of fabric peeking behind it. If you're going to be sewing these on your sewing machine, you want to use as little adhesive as possible to tack it together before you stitch it. So on something like this, I probably would just hold it together while I put it through my sewing machine, or use a little bit of dot adhesive. You don't want to use any super strong adhesives like red line tape or something like that, because when you run it through your sewing machine, it can gum up your needle going through that adhesive multiple times. So just keep that in mind. My sewing machine's only used for crafting projects like this. I don't sew clothes and things like that, so I don't worry about the damage to my sewing machine or making it difficult down the road to sew just regular fabric, because it can, you know, when you're stitching paper, when you're stitching into glue, it can, you know, gum up the machine a little bit. I've been stitching constantly for multiple years these little projects, and I haven't had any issue with my machine. Okay, let's talk about bow clippies, and that will be one of the last ones here. So I have this little drawer full of bow clippies up here, and we'll talk about stamping on fabric as well. So big fluffy bows, little bunny tail bows. There's lots of different ones out there. I'm just going to show you a couple of quick ones. This one here is from By the Wolf for God. we're all kind of familiar with the bunny ear bow clip. So let me show you how this is tied, and I will show you some alternatives and then how I do this big fluffy one. So you can do 2 pieces of fabric back to back. That way you have the pattern, you know, from the front to the back. So it's 2 pieces of fabric here, or just a single piece, just kind of depends on what you want. Okay, for the bunny ear look, you're going to take your fabric and fold it in half. And so the end that is the folded edge, you're going to put through your paper clip. And then you're going to bring the tails of the fabric up over the top of the paper clip through your loop over here. And then pull those nice and tight. And that is going to give you your bunny ear clip. So I like to start with a little bit longer of a piece of fabric than this is. This has already been trimmed down. It's a little bit easier to maneuver when you have a longer piece, and then you can go in and trim your tails down to whatever size that you want. And again, if you do the double-sided, then you wouldn't have that naked backside. It would be patterned on both sides, but it does make it a little bit chunkier. I also like to deconstruct these and just do an overhand knot. So I've got 1 piece of fabric here. Again, you can use 2 pieces back to back. I'm just going to thread one end through my paper clip there, and then I'm just going to do an overhand knot, just like we're tying our shoes. Pull that, and that's going to give me that more horizontal, floppy kind of bow look. And I just fuss with it till I get the fabric facing, you know, the direction that I want. And so that's going to give you just a different look. And I find that this sits a little bit higher on the paper clip, so it can fit more securely down onto a page. So there are those 2. For the big fluffy bows like this one here, I've got a longer piece of fabric, again, that I just snipped and tore, so I have my rough edges. But you could get super fancy and fold those over and sew them and have finished bows. I don't live that life, but you might prefer that. So we're gonna start just like we did with the overhand. So I'm gonna thread one end into my paper clip, down to about the center there. And you can do an overhand knot at this point and just tie a regular bow, which is probably a little bit more secure, but I found that it lays a little bit better if I skip the overhand knot part. So I've got my paper clip in the middle. I'm gonna make 2 little loops, little bunny ear loops, like we're tying our shoes, 2 loops. And then I'm just going to knot those 2 loops, again, like we're tying our shoes, and pull and fluff it until I get it facing fluffed the right direction. Sometimes it takes a little bit of maneuvering to get it the direction that it needs to be. And then you can just, sorry for the dogs, I think my family is coming home. Adjust your loops and tails to be the length that you need. Of course, then I would come in here and trim it. If you add interfacing, it's gonna have a little more substance to it and sit up a little bit better, but that gives you your big fluffy bow. Okay, I almost forgot about stamping on fabric, because I know I get questions about this as well. This is something I used to do and I haven't done recently, but if you're going to be stamping on fabric, yes, you can stamp on fabric, in case you didn't know that. You want to use STAYS-ON ink. Now, have I tried every ink? No. Will other inks work? Possibly, but I found best results come from using STAYS-ON. This ink is specifically made for stamping on things like acetate and plastic and fabrics and some of those more difficult mediums rather than paper. I don't usually use this ink when I'm just stamping on my Bible pages. It bleeds through, it's difficult to clean off your stamps, yada yada, all that goodness. But if I'm stamping on fabric, I definitely want to use STAYS-ON. And it's just the same as stamping on paper, as long as you're using the right ink, which I got all over my desk and now will be difficult to clean off because that stays on for you. A little bit of alcohol or even hand sanitizer will take it off of your blocks in your desktop. So there's a little Tip Tuesday within a Tip Tuesday. So I'm just gonna ink up a stamp, and then you can just stamp directly onto a tab, or to the fabric. So I'll stamp sometimes a keyword maybe that's in that passage on the tab that I'm using. If you wanna stamp on a piece and then cut it out and use that as an embellishment as part of your title or something like that. It really is not that complicated to stamp on here as long as you're using the right kind of ink. This is gonna make sure that it stands up to the test of time, and it also dries very, very quick. So I don't have to worry about the ink kind of bleeding and seeping out and not giving me a crisp impression, the Stays On seems to work best for that. So you can do it on your tabs, create little embellishments, things like that. So I hope that gives you some ideas for using fabric in your Bible. I know that there are probably 5,000 other ways to do it, but that just gives you a few examples and different ways that I do it. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to leave those down below, or maybe some tips and tricks that you have found along the way that's helpful for you. Check out the description box for links to everything that I used today. Give this video a thumbs up if it was helpful. If you are using fabric in your projects, tag me on Instagram, #LindseyDecor, and that way I can see how you're using fabric in your entries, but also you can search #LindseyDecor and then be able to see how other people are using it as well and get inspiration. So hope that was helpful. Subscribe to my channel if you're not already subscribed. Be sure to click on that bell notification button so you don't miss any future videos from me. And until next time, thank you so much. Bye-bye.